Welcome back to the Audiokinetic Theater. It is my great pleasure to introduce Matthew from Insomniac Games, who will be talking to us about the breathing system in Wwise middleware. Matthew, take us away.
Thank you all for coming. This is basically, this breathing system was my baby on Marvel Spider-Man 2, and I'm really excited to kind of break it down for you in a way it's basically a giant Russian doll set in Wwise with containers within containers within containers. And so what we're going to do in this presentation is we're basically going to break down all of those containers, and hopefully I can explain it to you in a way that is simple and easy to understand, even though it is a very complicated system. So what is the breathing system? So our breathing system in general is a dynamic procedural system created within Wwise middleware. And there are three basic poles that hold up this system. We have states and switches, we have a breath intensity RTPC, and we have the music system, which is the house that has all of the rules and transitions for us. So states and switches being if you are the character in the game and you are in either a stealth state, maybe you're in stealth, maybe you're in more of an ambient breathing state, or maybe you're in combat. That is the state of the game as to what's happening. The breath intensity is more of what your breath is like throughout your movement inside of that state. So you're either low or you're middle or you're high intensity breathing. And then the music system is how we're going to talk about how we're able to make rules and transitions to make sure that all of these things flow naturally between each other. So let's talk about the music system first. Generally, the music system was really great for us because it allowed us to create the rules and the transitions that we needed in order to make this system fantastic. So for example, the source is your source breaths or what's happening right now in the moment. So let's say you are playing as your character and you're using the controller to sprint, and that is what you are currently doing. And then your destination is what, as a character, you're going to the next phase of your movement. So if let's say you're sprinting, and then you're going to go more into a jogging mode from sprinting. That is your destination. Sprinting is the source. So the main problem that we had in the system that we were trying to create is the regular hierarchies in Wwise. We were trying to figure out how to transition well between the breaths, and we couldn't figure out how to get the assets to play without, when they were changing, the previous breaths would get cut off. And we were like, how do we figure out how to make a solution for this? And we found out that the music system actually has all of these rules and transitions in place. So, for example, here at the source, right here, in the bottom left-hand corner, these are rules that dictate what to do with the source breath when it transitions to the destination breath. So, for example, we can say exit source at exit cue, and I'll be talking more about the exit cues later, but basically, every clip that you have in the music system has an entry cue and an exit cue. And the exit cues are by default these red flags that you put right at the end of each clip. They are automatically added. So basically, by saying exit source at exit cue, we're basically saying play the source breath in its entirety before you transition to the next set of destination breaths. And that was the rule that prevented everything from getting cut off. And so that was already really exciting for us. Okay, it's like, okay, yeah, we can do this now. The second thing is, these two breaths here, Merry Breath Sprint and jogging, are two completely different breath speeds. So if you're going from sprinting and your character is going like, and you're going to more of a jogging breath and you're slowing that down, how do you make that transition sound good? Because they're completely different breath speeds. So what we were able to do is use these transition segments. It's a segment that triggers between the source and the destination that, in our case, was an insinuation of a slowdown. So each transition clip that we had two breaths that we were manually making it sound like the character was slowing down. So for example, if you're sprinting and you activate the transition segment, it'll go something like, and then it'll go into the destination breaths. And those two things, the rules and the transitions put together, really allowed us to be like, okay, this is great. We have the basic logic and functionality here to start moving forward. So now let's talk about this breath intensity RTPC. This is basically what's happening when you're in the game and you're moving and your intensity is changing. So we talked to gameplay, and what gameplay did for us is they created a system of numbers, basically, and these numbers were an amalgamation of basically a couple different types of things. There was movement, which is the basic one that we were doing, and then there was something like enemy proximity. This could also spike your breath intensity, and other things like jumping, etc. All of these different rules put together, amalgamated together, gave us a number. So the low intensity breathing were the smaller numbers. This was like from 0 to 10. And then the higher breath intensities were the numbers that were closer to 10. These numbers would come from the game into Wwise. And now what we had to do is figure out, okay, what do we do with these numbers and how do we fully connect this to Wwise here? And so we created a series of switches. And our 3 switches were heart rate intensity low, heart rate intensity medium, and heart rate intensity high. And we're basically saying what we do with the breath intensity is our RTPC, or our real-time parameter control. And the numbers 0 to 10 are right here. And on the y-axis is the switches. So basically, what we're doing is we're saying anything from 0 to 2 that comes from the game, we're going to have activate our heart rate intensity low switch. Anything from 2 to 7, we're going to have activate our heart rate intensity medium switch. And anything from 7 to 10, we're going to activate our heart rate intensity high switch. So now we've activated these switches when we get the numbers, but now we actually have to attach the audio assets to the switches. And so in this next slide, that's what we're basically doing. So this is an example of the character is in an ambient state, and inside this ambient music switch container here, we have our three music playlist containers: ambient low, ambient mid, ambient high. What we're doing is we're taking our heart rate intensity switches that we just made, we're attaching it to the music switch container, and then we're just simply dragging the correct asset containers into these switches. And now we have something working. So now that we have talked about the states and the heart rate intensity and the breath intensity, let's break this down on a music switch container level. So the first state that we had was the character breath system that's right at the top, and we had the character playable state. So we actually had multiple characters in our game, and each character had a different breathing system. And each breathing system was a switch container and another Russian doll set that had all these containers within it and all these rules and transitions, etc. So the first thing that we did was take all of the states. The character playable state basically said, when your character is present in the game and you're playing as that character, the state's going to say, this is the character you're playing as. We now attach that character state to our music switch container for that character. And now everything's in parity and everything's in sync. We had 4 different states here around, and we had these default states, and then we have specialty states. So right here, we have our normal state, which is over here, Brett's normal, and inside normal, we have ambient, combat, and stealth. These are the states that I was talking about earlier. These are the default states. And in this next slide, I will show you, yes. So this is a zoomed in picture of here. We have normal, we have sprint, we have anxious, and we have injured. Normal was our default, and then we had states such as sprint, injured, and anxious that were specialty states that would actually override the normal state, the normal character default state. So right here, we have the gameplay type state, combat, passive, and stealth. We are now attaching combat, ambient, and stealth music switch containers to those states. And so our anxious specialty state would override this gameplay type state. And what was really interesting about anxious is that anxious was actually event-based. So with anxious, we were able to attach it to a dialogue line in a certain part of the game where our character were like, okay, we want our character to be anxious now. And so as soon as they say this line, turn on anxious state, and then their anxious breathing will activate. And then we could wait a little bit and okay, here's another dialogue line that we want to stop triggering her anxious breathing now. And so later on, we'll say, on this next dialogue event, stop the anxious state. Another specialty state was sprint. We wanted our sprint state to be a separate state from the breath intensity matrix. And so sprinting would immediately turn her into a sprint state. And then within that sprint state, there's another set of rules and intensities inside of that. And we'll get to that in a minute. But right now, I'm going to tell you how this is all getting put together. So like I said, the specialty states are able to override the normal states. It's like, how does that happen? So here, we have a bunch of rules. We have a lot of rules here. So basically, states were added together to produce outcomes. For example, right here, this is our character breadth system that we're currently using. And here are all the states that are attached to that system. We have a state called cine effort state. And this state is basically a general state that we would apply to mute the breathing system in cinematics, since the breathing system was always running, it was always playing, so we had to figure out when to mute it when we didn't want it to play. So, for example, in the cinematics, we're muting the breathing, but if we're not muting the breathing, then this state is off. So, an example of a combination of states here is if the cine efforts are off, plus the hero is alive, plus the hero is in a normal state, plus the hero is not sprinting, then play Mary Brett's normal. And it's a combination. We had to basically have every permutation of rules in order to trigger a specific audio action. And so if you look at the rest of them here, you can see if anything is happening and they are in their normal state and then they are also anxious, the anxious will override. So there's right there, normal and anxious. So the anxious is going to override that normal default state, and you're going to start playing her anxious music switch container. So now we're going to dive into the sprint section. So sprint is its own thing. So you have all these states here, right? Sprint, if you are saying normal is normal, and all of a sudden you're going to say, now she's sprinting, you're going to start playing her music sprint container. And once you say play that music sprint container and she's in a sprinting state, then you're going to go into sprint, and sprint has its own set of rules. So we are additionally attaching the gameplay type state to the sprint switch container. We're also applying our anxious state to the sprinting so that she can sprint anxiously. And she can also sprint stealthily, and she can sprint in combat, and she has all these different permutations. So for example, if anything is happening and she's in sprint mode and she's anxious, play Mary Brett's anxious sprint. If she's not anxious, then we're going to play Mary Brett's ambient sprint. And if she's in combat, we're going to play combat sprint. You get the idea. What was also really interesting is in certain moments in the game, when we wanted a specific type of sprinting to play, we could actually have objective states. And so in a specific part of the game where she's running away from a character that we want to, I think there was some sprinting that was playing that wasn't what we wanted. And so we're like, no, right here in this part of the game, we want her to play her combat sprinting, and we want it to sound like she's like really running away from this person. So we were able to say, in A2 Nightmare Escape 1, in that section, only play her combat sprint. In A2 Nightmare Escape 2, only play her combat sprint. And so as you can see, we're able to have a lot of leverage here, and we're able to really trigger things when we want to trigger them. So now let's go into the audio assets. We're going really granular here. And just to recap for a second what we're doing here, we're now in her ambient container. She has 3 music playlist containers inside the ambient container, high, low, mid. We're attaching them to her breath intensities. Inside the ambient high music playlist container, we have a couple things going on. So one, we're playing her breaths in a continuous sequence that loops indefinitely until the end of time, until you switch to another state or another type of breathing. We wanted to make sure that this was happening since the breathing is always on and we're only muting it where we don't want it to play. We always want breathing and we never want it to stop. So here, we're able to say, we want the loop count to be infinite and we want to play a sequence continuous. Why we're doing a sequence is we have two things happening in the sequence. The screenshot doesn't show the second half of this, but I'm going to explain it. So inside sequence continuous, we have about 12 different ambient high assets that we are saying that we are going to shuffle between, and we're going to avoid repeating 10 of them so that basically none of them are, you're never going to hear the same breath twice. It's going to keep randomly going through all of them. What was really cool is this is where the sequence comes in. So we have these things called breath pauses. And this helped us in certain situations to create pauses in between these breaths so that we can change how fast the breathing was actually going. So basically, each breath asset had both an out breath and an in breath in it. So she'd be like, right? And that would be this part, the random continuous. And then after the random continuous breath would play, we would have a pause. And so if we had a longer pause, it would be pause, pause. Obviously, that's not natural, but we can adjust how long we want the pause to be. So we can shorten the pause, so it can be like, shorten it again. So we have a lot of leverage here. And sometimes the assets would play in such a way that we didn't actually need this pause. And so we didn't need that sequence. But in other places, we did need that sequence. And so this is just having that level of leverage so that we can adjust things to how specifically we want them to be. We're deciding how the assets play. So now that we've gone through how these clips are looping, real quick, we're going to go into, on the clip level, if you can remember earlier, I was talking about music exit cues and entry cues, and I just want to show you what that looks like on the clip level. So every time you create a clip, it automatically creates these entry and exit cues. The entry cue is in green, and the exit cue is in red. If you wanted to, you could drag this red exit cue, wherever you want it to be. It's not like specifically attached to the clip, but in our case, we want it to be right at the end of the clip. So when we activate that rule that says when you're transitioning from one breath type to another breath type, play the entire asset, that rule is now possible because we have that exit cue right here. So that's on the specific asset level. So now that we've talked about how we're basically randomly and continuously playing these assets, we're going to go into one of the transition segments that we were describing in the beginning, which is how we move from one breath type to another breath type. And the one that we're going to talk about is into sprinting. So this is basically saying, no matter what you're doing, if you go into sprint, this transition segment's going to play to where it's going to be a lead-in or a ramp-up into sprint. So these assets sound something like, and then she's going to start sprinting. So it sounded weird when we didn't have this because you could be jogging, and then all of a sudden she's like, so we wanted to, if you were going from idling specifically into sprinting, that ramp-up was really good and really natural and really important. These are one-shots. So if you have a music playlist container here, and then underneath that, you have Mary Envy's breaths into sprint 1. That is the music segment container. And then you have these clips. And I was able to move all of the clips into, it's a clip within, clips within a clip right here. And I was able to make a random container out of all of these clips. And so right here, what you're basically saying is, you're going to randomly play one of these one-shots. Whenever that into sprint transition is activated, one of these assets will play. And the same asset will never play twice. And so when we go to an example of the sprint transition here, going back to our transition matrix, this is where I'm going to tie everything together here. This is the rule. Any means it doesn't matter what you're doing. If you're doing anything and you go into sprint, the character starts sprinting, you're going to play her music playlist sprint container. When that happens, in this specific situation, we said, instead of using the exit cues, we're going to make this immediate. Because in this specific situation, transitioning immediately felt better to us. And we're going to use the transition segment that I said earlier, which is into sprint. So basically, like I was saying earlier, the result of that is, let's say you're idling and you're like, and then she starts sprinting immediately. She'll go immediately from that breath into, and she'll start sprinting. And so this is the breathing system. There are so many rules that we activated in here. There are so many containers, but really what I want you all to take away from this is these 3 pillars here. And the power of the music system and what it can do for you. So like I said, we have the states and switches. We have if she's in a stealth state, if she's in a combat state. We have our heart rate intensity, which is based off of her movement. So if she's in a stealth state, she will run in accordance with her intensity. And then the music system is really what allows us to transition between all of these properties effectively. And that's what allowed us to have a really great and natural breathing system for our game. Any questions? Thank you so much.